Welcome back to Praxis 5581, 5589, 5580, whichever your state code is. It's all based on the same information. I haven't found much difference. Whether you're elementary, high school, they're all the same. The only difference is the code number. Come study with me. Let's get and dive into Module 3. Click on the next slide. All right. So this topic is going to start as establishing a new nation. We are going to discuss how Great Britain, after the French and Indian War, Great Britain decided that it was going to restrict the colonies by telling them you can't build or you can't move beyond the Appalachian Mountains under the Proclamation of 1763. This was the start of aggravation for the colonies because they were thinking, well, we won the war, why can't we move? And they didn't quite get it when all Britain had to explain. Well, Britain probably explained, but they didn't accept their explanation that the Native Americans were not accepting them and they needed to stay where they were for safety reasons. So then we had an anti-American, George Grenville, who became a prime minister and felt like he could just solve all of the problems that Britain was having, and he certainly did try. Um, then we have an uprising that takes place by the Ottawa chief named Pontiac. He was able to kill quite a bit of colonists. It was a bloody Indian uprising. Uh, he thought he could drive the entire white population into the sea. He didn't win, but he did kill quite a bit of colonists. So then Grenville decided that he would send the Navy, the Royal Navy, to suppress the American smuggling that was going on, because obviously people didn't want to follow Britain's rules and taxes, so they would try to find a way around it by smuggling stuff. And so the Grenville decided, well, you know what? You know those navigation acts that Britain was sleeping on. I'm going to enforce them. And he sent the Navy to just violently do just that, enforce it. So then Britain was, uh, well, we can look at the cause of the revolution, which is, like I said, the aggravation started when they couldn't move beyond the Appalachian Mountain. But we really see the colonists showing resentment when Britain started passing taxes from across the ocean. Okay, the British Parliament decided that the colonists needed to pay for the war, the French and Indian War, and so they passed the Sugar Act in 1764, which so let me back up just a couple of sentences. So the cause of the revolution was the taxes that Britain was putting on the colonists. Okay, so then we get into the taxes. So in 1764, you got the Sugar Act that was placed on sugar, coffee, and wine, among other things, but mainly sugar, coffee, and wine was the issue because obviously people drank a lot, people had a lot of coffee, and they needed sugar. So then, after that, they had the Stamp Act, which was in 1765. And this put a tax on printed material in the colonies. Okay. So then we had the Americans protesting. Wait a minute, you can't tax us because we have no representation in Parliament. And this is where the famous slogan came in with no representation, no taxation without representation. But Parliament responded by saying, "You are represented. You're represented by all of Parliament." Of course, that was not even a slight of remedy. So then they came out with more acts. There was the Quartering Act, which allowed the locals had to feed the Navy, okay, and house them, whether it was a private residence or not. They had to house them. Uh, Then we have the Townshend Acts, which was an imported tax on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Well, at this point, the colonists were beyond upset, and they decided that they were going to boycott the British and their goods and cut off their income. And when they did that, of course, Grenville sent the uh, Navy, and there was a standoff, and 5 people was killed, and they refer to that as the Boston Massacre of 1770. So, uh, yeah, that's basically what you need to get from that. All right, so after the Boston Massacre, Parliament saw that the colonists were not joking. They were serious about, they were unhappy about the taxes. So then they decided, okay, you know what? I'll take it back. And they rescinded all of the taxes except for one, and it's the three-penny tax on tea. And uh, that worked for a while. However, the British decided after a while to allow the British East India Company to sell tea directly to colonists for a reduced price. They were trying to save the company and stop it from bankrupting. And then after a while, the colonists got upset on that, and because they thought that all of the taxes would be rescinded, but when it wasn't, uh, they got upset and they dumped all of the tea in the ocean, and this is referred to as the Boston Tea Party. That should be paid attention to as well, because it's mentioned in every note, every book, every text, every material. So the Boston Tea Party is as a result of the tea tax, and it is a resistance that the colonials were taking against the British and their taxations. So then Parliament was trying to stop or remain control, and they put all 4 acts collectively into the Coercive Acts. The first one was the Boston Port Act, which closed the port of Boston to all trade until the colonists would agree to pay for the tea. And as you could imagine, if they couldn't, if ships couldn't come in and out, they couldn't get supplies. So the second was the Massachusetts Government Act, which increased the power of the Massachusetts Royal Governor. And then you had the Administration of Justice Act, which provided that anybody accused of crime in Massachusetts could be tried anywhere where they could possibly get acquitted somewhere else. And then there was the Quartering Act, which was already discussed, but it was greatly enforced because uh, it allowed the British troops to be housed in private homes as well as regular families, which is created a burden for the Americans more than it helped. Uh, Parliament, by this point, had the colonists even more angry than ever before. Then they came up with the Quebec Act, which extended the province of Quebec to the Ohio River, established Catholicism and as the official religion, and then set up a government. All right, so it's quiz time. Let's see what all we can uh, take away from what we've read so far. So, what was so significant about the First Great Awakening? You should have gathered that this was significant because it was the first event that affected all of the colonies. What started the discontent with the British after the French and Indian War? You should have remembered that the British issued the Proclamation of 1763, which prevented the colonies from moving west of the Appalachian Mountains. This angered them because they thought winning the war meant that they could have the land that they were promised. Number 3. What is the name of the strong anti-American prime minister who thought that he could solve Britain's problems? You should have remembered George Grenville. Number 4. Who led the Indian uprising and was an Ottawa chief? You should have remembered Pontiac. Number 5. Grenville sent the Royal Navy to vigorously enforce what? You should have remembered the Navigation Acts. Number 6. What ignited the fire of resentment in the colonies? Britain's taxes. So if you remember, first, Britain prevented them from moving into the property that they were promised, and then secondly, they added taxes onto them, such as sugar and stamps. That just sent them over the edge. Number 7. What was the purpose of the sugar and stamp tax acts? If you remember, those acts were created to make the colonists pay for the war. Britain decided that the colonists needed to pay for protection. And number 8. This act allowed the British troops to be housed with the colonists in their personal homes. You should have remembered the Quartering Act. Number 9. See if you can recall what the following acts do. Stamps, sugar, navigation, or quartering. All right, so it's clear. Number 10. How did the colonists get the British to rescind the Stamp Act? If you remember, the colonists began to boycott the British goods, and they were doing violent attacks. So it forced against the agents, so it forced them to take it back, to thinking that that would get the colonists to comply. Number 11. This tax was placed on glass, lead, and paint. You should have remembered the Townshend Acts. Number 12. What is the name of the event that involved the British troops killing 5 Bostonians? You should remember the Boston Massacre of 1770. Number 13. Parliament rescinded all of the Townshend duties except for which one? You should remember the 3-penny tax on tea. And number 14. What company was allowed to sell tea directly to the colonists at a reduced price to prevent bankruptcy? You should have remembered the British East India Company. Number 15, or what should have been number 15, looks like a number jump here. Excuse me. What is the name of the colonists' resistance to the Tea Act as they dumped tea into the ocean? You should have remembered the Boston Tea Party. Anything to do with dumping tea in the ocean is the Boston Tea Party, because it's one of a kind event in history. Number 15. What is the name given to a collective of acts in response to the colonist destruction? This is the coercive acts. Number 16. Which act closed the port of Boston? The Boston Port Act. And number 17, what act increased the power of the governor using legislators? You should have remembered the Massachusetts Governor Act. How did you go over your answers? Okay, the last three questions couldn't fit. The more I wrote on that slide, the smaller it got, so I put it here. Number 18. This act allowed punishment of crimes in Massachusetts to be tried in other areas where chances of acquittal could be greater. You should remember the Massachusetts Government Act. Number 19. Governor Gage used this act to house his troops in private homes. This is sort of kind of a repeat question, so you should remember the Quartering Acts. Number 20. This act extended province to Ohio River, established Roman Catholicism as its official religion and set up government. You should remember the Quebec Act. Sum it up. How did you do? Go over any answers you have incomplete. Okay, the last. All right. So to bring our new nation topic to a complete, we're going to discuss what happened after the last topic we discussed, which is the Quebec Act. And you should remember that the Quebec Act is simply the extended province of Quebec to the Ohio River and establishing the Roman Catholicism, as well as setting up government and making Catholic the established religion. But anyway, now we're going to talk about the Intolerable Acts, which the Americans combined the Coercive Acts and the Quebec Act together. Okay, so they basically put all of the Coercive Acts and the Quebec Acts together. I would imagine that there was too many acts for them to probably manage or remember, so that's why they did this. So in response to the Coercive Acts, the First Continental Congress was called and met in Philadelphia on September 1774. They were petitioning to Parliament for a break from all of these taxes and trying to come up with a solution. At this point in the whole interaction between the British and the colonies were not requesting or seeking to be separated from Britain yet. They were still trying to work it out and negotiate with Britain and figure out a way to be at peace. Then we had the Second Continental Congress, because by this, the first one didn't do much, and they were still having issues between Britain and with their taxes, and they could tell that they were heading for a war. So when the Second Continental Congress issued, they discovered, or they all agreed, which is a meeting, that the Second and First Continental Congresses are meetings. Like how we have congressional meetings, well, you can think of these as meetings just like that. And at the Second Continental Congress meeting, they discussed that King James was a tyrant. They all agreed that he was a tyrant. They all hated the Quartering Act because the troops had to be housed in their personal homes. Okay? They all wanted peace from Parliament and their control in their internal affairs. So then we go on to King George, who succeeded his grandfather as the King of Britain in 1760. And he was no better than the first one, but he was determined to have control. He thought that he could do better than what King George II could do or did. And so he was determined to have control, complete control over the American colony. And this, in return, is what caused the revolution, because King George was not willing to waver or work with the colonies. The colonies had turned to King George and sent him a list of grievances in the Declaration of Independence. Then we have John Adams, who was a well-known Harvard-educated lawyer from Massachusetts. He defended the British soldiers at the massacre in 1760. You can imagine how that came off. He was also a delegate in both the first and second Continental Congress, and he is one of the leaders for independence. Then we have George Washington. He was from Virginia, and he was in the military. He fought in the French and Indian War. He became colonel after that war, and he was the only one to wear his military uniform to the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia, May 1775. There, he was appointed commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, and he was unanimously elected as the first president. Thomas Jefferson is a delegate from Virginia. He was 33, and he was the youngest to be able to attend the Continental Congress. He was one of the authors of the Declaration of Independence, and he succeeded Benjamin Franklin as minister to France. He was also vice president to Adams, and nevertheless he won. He did win and became president later on. Then we have Thomas Paine. Now Thomas Paine is one of the Enlightenment thinkers, so his name is important for you to remember as well. He was convinced to come to America after meeting Benjamin Franklin. He wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense. This is why it's important for you to know who he is, and it's important for you to remember what his pamphlet says, Common Sense. It basically advocated that Britain, across the ocean, should not be controlling the American colony. It was in favor of revolution and separation from the motherland. Paine also opposed strongly the monarchy and wanted a Republican government. And Republican, to him, or his belief, is that government should be based on the consent of the governed. That's very important. You're going to read about that every time. That government should be based on the consent of the governed. His strong words helped to overcome the loyalty many still felt to the monarchy. It was him who helped push the last few naysayers towards revolution. All right. All right. So more about the American Revolution and how it first started. So when the British colonists, or should I say when the colonists held their first Continental Congress, it should be noted that the British didn't pay them any attention. They really ignored all of their demands and requests. In fact, they responded by sending more troops to further show them that they were not doing anything with that first meeting. As more troops as more troops invaded the colonies, we can imagine how emotions were flared. One thing led to another, and 700 British troops were set out this one night when someone began firing. This is the story that has the myth that we don't know who fired, and so we don't know who started the American Revolution with the first blow, but it should be noted that this skirmish took place on Lexington and Concord, which the open warfare that began at the war. The militia, though, came in large numbers, so the men that the British sent, they didn't stand a chance. People were serious by this point about their independence from Britain. So next we have the next battle after that. We look at the taking of Fort Ticonderoga, which was handled by more militia. The British tried to take it and didn't get anywhere. That's when they started taking the Americans seriously, because hundreds of thousands of British soldiers were killed or wounded, and it turned out to be the bloodiest battle of the war. So after that, we had the Second Continental Congress meeting. This time, with the first one, they were still seeking peace and trying to figure out how to work with Britain. The second time, they were announcing, or should I say, denouncing Britain and its rules, laws, and discussing its grievances, such as just all of the issues that they were having with the king. I don't want to go into much detail because it does come up again later. Next, we have the Declaration of Independence, which is drafted by Thomas Jefferson. He is the main author, one of the main authors, so you should remember him in his natural rights philosophy, which stemmed from John Locke. Next, we have General Lord Charles Cornwallis. He was aggressively following George Washington, and he actually forced George Washington to retreat for a while there. It looked like it was a lost cause, but General Howe decided to wait for the spring. He got cocky, thought for sure he had George Washington cornered, and so he said to celebrate, and then George Washington participated in the bull strike. He said, let's get them while they were drunk and partying. And sure enough, he easily overpowered them because a lot of them were, like I said, drinking. And it became a bold and one of the most notable wars, because it's what convinced the French and Spanish to join the war against England. Well, not necessarily the Spanish right away, but the French immediately joined against England, and eventually the Spanish followed suit. The American commander, Nathaniel Greene, had a lot of brilliant strategies. He ended up with a crushing victory at Cowpen, South Carolina. Okay, it's quiz time. Number 1. The Quebec Act and Corsive Acts were combined and referred to as what? You should have remembered that these acts were combined and referred to as the Intolerable Acts. Number 2. This man wore his military uniform to the Second Continental Congress and was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. You should have remembered George Washington. Number 3. This meeting was held to seek peace from Parliament and relief from taxes. You should have remembered the First Continental Congress. Number 4. This man was deemed a tyrant at the Continental meetings. You should remember King George III. Number 5. This man defended the Redcoats, or British soldiers, and led the movement for independence. You should remember John Adams. Number 6. This meeting was the second of its kind, and those involved determined that independence was needed. You should remember the Second Continental Congress. It's easy to determine these two apart because the first one they were still seeking peace, the second one they were done with Britain. And number 7, what were some of the grievances announced at the second congressional meeting? They list King George as a tyrant. They believed that Parliament wanted control without the consent of the colonists. They resented the Quartering Acts. How did you do? Go over your answers. All right, this is the second half. All of it couldn't fit on the other slide. So here we go. I'm going to dive right into it. Number 8. This man was the youngest to attend the congressional meetings and drafted the Declaration of Independence. If you remember, Thomas Jefferson is the only one that was discussed as the directly being an author of the Independence. Several of them were parts of it, but he was the most notable one. Number 9. This man was responsible for writing Common Sense and advocated for independence from Great Britain. You should remember that Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense, and he was advocating for independence. Number 10, true or false? Thomas Paine strongly advocated for monarchy and not a republican government. This is false, as Thomas Paine advocated for a republican government, not a monarchy. Number 11, where did the first set of strikes take place during the American Revolution? And I gave you a hint. Gage decided to destroy stockpile and ammunition here. You should have remembered Lexington and Concord. Number 12. Which battle was the bloodiest battle and resulted in the American forces taking this fort on Lake Champlain? And you should remember Fort Ticonderoga. All right. Number 13. These lines were taken from what important document? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. This should sound like the Declaration of Independence to you, especially the all men are created equal part, because you'll see that in several different documents or questions. Number 14. As George Washington was near defeat and began to retreat, who aggressively followed? You should have remembered General Lord Charles Cornwallis. And this man underestimated Washington's army and decided to wait until spring to finish annihilating Washington's army. You should remember General Howe. He got cocky and decided, you know what, we can kill them in the spring when it's warm, and they started partying. Check your answers. How did you do? The last 3 questions. Number 16. What did Washington do on Christmas night while the British were drunk and riding out the winter? This is a question that stemmed from the last card. You should remember that Washington decided on a bold strike to attack the Hessians while they were relaxing and partying. It ended up being a victory, and Washington was saved because they were actually stranded without supplies. So their bold strike was it saved them until the more reinforcements could show up. Number 17, which battle victory convinced the French to join openly in the war against England? You should have remembered the Battle of Saratoga. And number 18, this American commander had a brilliant strategy that led to victory at Cowpens, South Carolina. And you should remember Nathaniel Greene. This brings it to complete. Go over your answers.